Well, good afternoon, U.S. history. Today is Tuesday, April 21st. We're in the second week of Unit 5, the 1990s to today. The point for today's lecture notes, all of these are posted. The PowerPoint is posted on Canvas. The note catcher is posted there. So as we go through, you can fill that out or obviously follow along with the PowerPoints and complete that note catcher submitting on Canvas. On the calendar or on the assignment itself, I included direct links to all the videos that are referenced in the PowerPoint. So take some time, you can go through and view those at your own leisure. But otherwise, we're going to get right into it. All right. So, really, what we're talking about here are the Clinton years, 1992 to the year 2000. So, again, our learning targets looking at describing the political shifts and explaining how they relate to previous decades and an ability to make a prediction about political changes in the future. We can connect the rise of globalism and the influence of terrorism on our economic and foreign policy and demonstrate how technology has changed over the past decades. So today we're really looking at the political shifts. At the end of this week on Friday, you have a technology timeline that kind of gets into how technology has evolved since the 90s until today. So we start talking about a technological revolution. If you don't know what this building is already, this is Apple's headquarters in Cupertino, California. This is One Infinite Loop is their address. And Silicon Valley in the southern part of San Francisco, California, really became the center of the tech industry beginning back in the early 1990s. And a lot of this stems from microprocessors. These were new chips that were made that made computers faster and smaller. So whereas computers in the 60s and 70s were almost as big as my room or my office that I'm in right now, now we have processors and computers that you wear on your watch or in your phone. So microprocessors making those computer chips smaller and faster. So, and right now over here we have Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, founders of Apple Computer. They started it in 1976 with the Apple I, and the Apple II in 1977 became that very first affordable, I use that in quotations, home computer. I remember growing up in the 80s, we had an Apple IIe, which was a giant monstrosity. That was one of those first series of home computers. They actually found some competition with a company called International Business Machines, or IBM. So IBM established that PC or personal computer, and Bill Gates, starting Microsoft, really was based off a DOS operating system and the Windows operating system of MS-DOS. So now you start to have this kind of gold rush in technology with Apple and Steve Jobs, and Microsoft and Bill Gates. This is a picture of the very first Apple computer. If you notice that it's actually made out of wood. If you found, I think this is, if this isn't the one that's in the Smithsonian, there is one in the Smithsonian. The first Apple computer, if you actually have an Apple One, that is millions of dollars right there. To be able to find this. There are a few that still exist. They find them in garages and attics all the time. But this is a version of the Apple One. So we start to look at new telecommunications. So the Telecommunications Act of 1996 allowed competition between cable and phone companies. So really started to see a rise in cellular telephones. The first network for cell phones was built in the 1980s. And in the 1990s, it started to lower that cost for service. This is one of the first commercially available cell phones there. I think that was the very first one I had. That was not a Microtac, but the Motorola. I think it stored 10 numbers in it. But because of microprocessors, you were able to see digital cameras and digital music players start to come out in the late 1990s. So right over here, this is one of the first commercially available digital cameras. This was made from Sony. And what was so interesting about this camera from Sony was that its removable memory was a 1.4 megabyte floppy disk. So the floppy disks were pretty cheap. You could take a floppy disk, put it inside that digital camera, and take photos with it. But obviously, as resolution increased, storage capacity also increased, and it quickly eclipsed that 1.4 megabyte threshold. So now you started to see the implementation of smaller flash media drives. Over here, this is the Creative Nomad. This is really the first commercially available MP3 player. So everything that you know about the iPhone, the iPod being the predecessor to that, the Creative Nomad MP3 player, that was one of the first you could buy. I think it held about 100 songs on it. So again, you start looking at that flash memory. Internet in the 1990s began really as a system of linking government computers. Universities started to connect themselves next. Um, the World Wide Web, the web, and email are not internet. The internet is a physical network of computers connected together through cable or phone lines, which eventually then leads to what we call wireless networks. But you started to see a rise in the late 1990s of internet service providers. Most, if you talk to your parents, the first internet service provider they probably had was AOL, or America Online. That was your way to access the internet, was through an internet service provider. So when we talk about the World Wide Web, the www that comes before an address, we start to look at hypertext or links. So again, if you click on that and it takes you to this YouTube video, that's hypertext, anything that it kind of makes that jump. The first web browsers out there were something called Mosaic or Netscape Navigator and America Online. So where we use Chrome or Firefox or Safari. Today, those first browsers were Mosaic, Netscape, and AOL. We started to see what they called the dot-com boom, or the tech bubble. Internet companies in the late 1990s were printing money. Their value went up and up and up and up and up. And the problem with overvaluing an internet company is that they don't actually make a product that you can tangibly touch. So eventually that bubble burst in the early 2000s. So people who had invested a lot in the stock market into these companies lost that money pretty much overnight. But you saw companies that came out of that are still around today. Amazon being probably the biggest of them. Amazon really was an online book retailer. They sold books. That was about it. Google and Yahoo. Yahoo's kind of gone away. They've had some hacks there, but they still are around. But Google, Amazon, Yahoo survived that dot-com bubble. Here's just a screenshot of what that early Mosaic browser would look like. You could type, this is where your URL would go. As you notice, most of it is going to be, if it's not monochromatic, it's very basic color schemes. Here's Yahoo. That was that first search engine. I mean, this was where I went pretty much all through college in the late 90s, early 2000s. You were able to go, and this is where you type in your search, but then they would have other ways for you to categorize your web pages, and you could go and investigate it that way. So as we eclipse the 90s and go into the early 2000s, we start to look at the popularity of web logs or blogs, kind of like online diaries that kind of gained popularity, which led into one of those first social media platforms being MySpace. MySpace, probably right around 05-ish, 06, really started to take off. But it was pretty hard to navigate. If you're not familiar, or ask your parents about their MySpace pages, there was a lot of programming, there was a lot of HTML, there was coding that had to be done. If you wanted to change your background, you were really doing copy and pasting computer code in order to do that. And YouTube and Google Video were actually competing at one point in time. And one of my favorite aspects of the old system of YouTube was the Daily 100, was the top videos of the day, and they would have it listed on their homepage by view, and you would see some of those early viral videos. We skip back here. We talked, Bill Clinton, sworn in 1992. He was 46 years old. He was very young, first Democrat in 12 years, and he was the first baby boomer president, so the first child of the World War II generation. And his focus really was on the economy, on family structure, family units, education, crime, and healthcare. Quite a few of those. This image here is taken from the Arsenio Hall show. Arsenio Hall hosted a late night show in the 90s. Bill Clinton came on there while he was campaigning and played the saxophone. It was kind of a famous moment there. Clinton running on the economy, he wanted to raise taxes and cut federal spending. It was focusing on lowering the federal trade deficit, basically how much money that we were owed and were spending. Half of all government spending went to entitlement programs. So things like Social Security and Medicare, those are huge parts of the government's budget. His idea was to raise taxes on middle and upper income Americans. He put new taxes on gasoline, on oil and natural gas. So when you talk about Democrats, like we did in the previous chapter or previous unit, about bigger government and raising tax revenue, if you want to spend money, you have to collect it, and that comes through taxes. At that point, 40 million Americans, about 15% of Americans, did not have health insurance. He put pressure on employers in order to try to lower that number, but many employers argued they couldn't afford to pay those insurance premiums. His health care reform bill died in Congress. It was very, very unpopular. So what Barack Obama was able to push through in the mid 2010, 2014, when he was able to push through some of the healthcare reforms there, all of that stuff really started back with Carter and Bill Clinton, and it never actually was passed through Congress. It wasn't until the 2000s with Barack Obama. He did establish things like the Family Medical Leave Act, saying that if to take care of a family member, or if you have health issues, 12 weeks per year you can take as unpaid family leave. You're not getting paid in most instances. FMLA does not give you that money, or does not give you a paycheck. However, you're able to take that through your employer and essentially hope to be able to come back to that employer at the end of that 12 weeks. He also started the AmeriCorps in 1994, 20,000 volunteers working to improve housing, literature, and environmental issues in low-income areas. So crime and gun control. So unfortunately, we never get to the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. So this guy right here, James Brady, was Ronald Reagan's press secretary. There was a shooting. Ronald Reagan was shot right underneath the arm. He obviously did survive that. His press secretary was shot in the head in this assassination attempt. He also did survive. He pushed for establishing a waiting period on the purchases of handguns. Bill Clinton signed the Brady Bill into law, that essentially said if you were purchasing a handgun, that there was a waiting period involved, and you have to go through a background check. Basically, make sure that you haven't committed crimes, that you don't have, you're not on drugs for mental health, if you don't have convictions, basically a background check and a waiting period for purchases of handguns. This crime bill put 100,000 more police officers on the street, and it banned 19 kinds of assault weapons. So knowing what you know about partisan politics, any sort of gun control and gun bans are going to be unbelievably unpopular with about half of the country. But Bill Clinton, James Brady signs the Brady Bill, essentially putting a waiting period on handguns. So 1994, here's Newt Gingrich, he's Speaker of the House. He establishes what he calls the Contract with America as a Republican, a very conservative Republican. His pledge is with the House to lower taxes, to reform welfare recipients, pass strict anti-crime laws, and balance the budget. So in 1996, Bill Clinton wins re-election with 49% of the popular vote, 379 of the electoral votes. The economy continues to improve well into the end of the 1990s. In 1998, the government ran a surplus, which was the first time in decades that had happened, where the government was actually had money left over. Most of the second term for Bill Clinton was focused on foreign policy and the inevitable scandal. So here is the Electoral College map that we have there for 1996. So now we get to the impeachment. Okay, much like Donald Trump was impeached earlier this year, Bill Clinton was impeached. There was some scandal coming out, one of which was called Whitewater. There were some illegal real estate loans going on while Clinton was governor of Arkansas. Also, it came out to that he had an inappropriate relationship with a female intern, her name being Monica Lewinsky. And he was eventually impeached, not because of these deals, not because he had an affair. It was the perjury. It was lying under oath about the affair. So he was under oath, and he denied having a relationship with that woman. And on December 19th of 1998, the House of Representatives passed 2 articles of impeachment. So just like we had articles of impeachment from Nancy Pelosi in the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives, the House, controlled by the Republicans, passed 2 articles of impeachment, and it moved to the Senate for trial. In February of 1999, the Senate voted 55 to 45 against perjury, 50-50 on the obstruction of justice, and it was short of the 2/3 vote needed in order to remove Bill Clinton from office. So, much like Donald Trump, going down in the history books, he was impeached, but he was not removed from office. So here are some of the pictures there. Here's, he's given saying, I did not have relations with that woman. Here's Monica Lewinsky. Here's another picture while she was working in the White House. Yeah. So if you ever, there's lots to dig into in the Lewinsky scandal. So we shift over to Clinton's foreign policy. Haiti, there was a military overthrow of that elected government. The United Nations established trade embargoes, trying to, put restrictions on the island of Haiti. Bosnia and Kosovo in Eastern Europe, they were the former Yugoslav republic. So after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the falling of the Soviet Union, you have all of these former republics. Bosnia and Kosovo, the Serbians began ethnic cleansing. Basically, they were going and killing many Muslims within those countries. The Serbians were yes, again, charged with crimes, with war crimes for their ethnic cleansing, the murder of Muslims within that former Yugoslav republic. So here's a little map of the Balkans. Here's Kosovo. Here's Serbia. Okay, here's Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Albania. So you can kind of see all of these kind of bordering the Adriatic Sea here. But yes, predominantly within Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Oh, doesn't this picture look familiar? If you just replace it with Jimmy Carter. We talked some Mideast peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians. And the idea that globalism, the idea that the world is increasingly interconnected, the idea that trade benefits everyone, that trade within countries helps one another. We're seeing the rise of international corporations. First of which being NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. It was passed in 1994. Again, that was Newt Gingrich and that contract with America. They wanted to be able to lower trade barriers between Canada, New Mexico, and the United States. We also started to see the formation of what we know as the European Union. They adopted a common bank and currency there with the euro. We've just seen the UK and exit the European Union. But you have all of these countries here. What they wanted to do was make it easier for people to travel between those countries, to trade between the countries, and have that common currency of the euro. And then we see the same thing sort of with Asia, or APEC, the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation. 47% of all global trade occurs between these member nations. So you're seeing United States, Canada, Mexico, but we're Russia, Japan, China, Australia, All of these countries here in green are members of the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation. The WTO, 1994, there's 120 member nations of the World Trade Organization. And we start to see a rise in the 80s and 90s of global warming. Some blame carbon monoxide emissions. And then the signing of the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, that would be basically lowering or increasing the standards for global warming in an effort to reduce it. And that would be something that Trump famously removed the United States from the Kyoto Protocol when he took office in 2016. So some questions here. The company Intel revolutionized computers by combining several integrated circuits on a single chip called a microprocessor. C. Clinton was impeached because he committed ethnic cleansing. No. Overtaxation. No. Robbery. No. But perjury. He lied under oath. And the process of the world becoming increasingly interconnected is called globalization. Democrats passing a law during the Clinton administration that tightened gun control. That is not the Brady Bunch. It's not the anti-gun law. It is the Brady Bill, letter D. And the Contract to America was proposed by then Republican Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich.
Dad, are you good here?
I'm good, buddy. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
NAFTA joined Canada, Mexico, and the United States in a free trade zone. Why was it beneficial? Because it increased our exports to Canada and Mexico. We were able to trade a little bit easier. So that wraps up those Clinton year notes. Please make sure that you've gone through and responded and completed that note catcher. I'm just pulling it up here. I couldn't remember which one I made this week. That was not one that I had made this week. I'd had that one already. Kind of going over the schedule for the rest of this week, guys. So we have that today. On Thursday, we will meet at our normal class time at 8:35 and look at the Y2K scare in the election of 2000. And there is a note catcher that goes along with that. On Friday, there's a technology timeline. It's a rather lengthy assignment. So definitely give yourself some time there. Obviously, if you need more, take care of that. As we kind of move through, I'm trying to keep up on grades. If you have questions about that, please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, have a great Tuesday.